Welcome to your deep dive on understanding and managing depression. You often hear about how common depression is, but it still feels, I don't know, kind of like a taboo subject.
Right. Like it's this thing we whisper about, but don't really talk about openly.
Exactly. And that's why this deep dive is so important. We're really diving deep into the source material you provided.
We really are. And you know that podcast excerpt you sent us, the one we're focusing on for this deep dive?
Yeah?
That one really hit home for me, the way it talked about depression as a medical condition.
Uh,
That really struck a chord with me.
Me too. It's like finally someone's saying it. It's not just a case of the blues. It's not about like thinking happy thoughts, you know?
And that's a huge part of why there's still so much stigma around it, right? People don't always get that it's a real medical condition. And that means it has real causes and, thankfully, real
It's
treatments.
like having a broken leg, right? You wouldn't tell someone to just walk it off if they had a broken leg.
Exactly. You'd get them an x-ray, cast, maybe some physical therapy. You wouldn't expect them to just magically heal themselves with positive thinking.
And that's what I appreciate about the way this excerpt describes the actual experience of depression. It doesn't sugarcoat it, like
Right. Yeah.
the fatigue, the loss of interest in things you used to love. Heck, even physical pain was in there. That's rough.
Yeah, it doesn't shy away from how deeply depression can impact every single aspect of a person's life.
Mm.
This excerpt really drives home that it's not just a bad day. It's this persistent, fog that can settle on your mood, your energy, your relationships, even the way you view yourself.
And to our listener, if you're listening to this and any of this resonates with you, if you're relating to these experiences, first and foremost, you are not alone. Seriously, you are not alone in this.
Millions of people all over the world experience depression. And the fact that I as treatable, that there's hope, that's what's so important for people to hear.
100%. But before we jump into the solutions, the treatments, all of that, maybe we should back up for a sec.
Okay, yeah, good idea.
Because this excerpt, it does a great job of highlighting those potential causes of depression. It talks about genetics, life events, and brain chemistry.
It lays it all out there. And I think for a lot of people, understanding those causes is I don't know, it can be a relief in a way. Oh, it's not just me. There's a reason why I feel this way.
Totally. It can be really validating to understand those why factors, wouldn't you say?
Absolutely. And it can empower you to make more informed decisions about your treatment and what works best for you.
So let's unpack those causes, starting with genetics. I have to admit, that one always throws me for a loop. Like, how much of this is predetermined? Is depression something you're just born with?
Well, it's not quite as simple as inheriting your mom's eye color.
Okay, good. Because I was going to say,
It's more how can I explain this? Imagine inheriting your grandma's sourdough starter.
sourdough starter. Where are we going with those?
Hear me out. Hear me out. You inherit the starter, right? But whether or not you end up with a delicious loaf of bread, that depends entirely on what you do with it, how you feed it, the environment you keep it in, all of that. Same with genetics and depression.
Okay, so you're saying it's like a predisposition, not a life sentence.
Exactly. You might inherit genes that make you more vulnerable to depression, especially if it runs in your family. But it's not a guarantee. It's all about how those genes interact with your environment, your experiences, your lifestyle. Which brings us to our next factor, life events.
Right, because those can pack a punch.
Oh, absolutely.
Trauma, loss, chronic stress. It's like no wonder these things can impact your mental health. I mean, that seems pretty straightforward. But I'm curious what's actually happening in the brain when we go through these difficult experiences.
Okay, so picture your brain as this incredibly intricate, delicate ecosystem.
Hmm.
Think like a rainforest. When we go through difficult life events, it's like a storm rolling through that rainforest. It can disrupt pathways, cause damage, and leave the entire ecosystem vulnerable.
Wow, that's a powerful image.
Right. It's not just about getting over these events emotionally or mentally. It's about understanding that they can have a very real, tangible impact on our brain's structure and function, especially if we experience these events during crucial developmental periods like childhood or adolescence.
It's like those events can leave an actual imprint on our brains.
Exactly. And that takes us to our third factor,
Right.
brain chemistry. This is where we dive into the fascinating world of neurotransmitters, those chemical messengers in our brains.
Okay, so we hear a lot about serotonin and dopamine, but can you break those down for me?
Sure. Think of it this way. Your brain is like a bustling city, right? Lots of activity, messages flying back and forth. Neurotransmitters are like the couriers, delivering important messages between different parts of the city.
Makes sense so far.
Serotonin and dopamine. Those are the feel-good couriers. They're the ones delivering messages of happiness, motivation, pleasure, reward, all that good stuff.
So when we talk about depression and brain chemistry, are we talking about being low on those feel-good couriers?
It's a bit more nuanced than that. It's not just about having low levels of serotonin or dopamine, although that can be a factor.
Mm.
It's more about the overall balance and communication between all the different neurotransmitters and how well they're doing their jobs. Like, are those messages getting delivered on time and to the right places? Or are there, like, roadblocks and detours?
So it's like, if all the feel-good couriers get stuck in traffic, suddenly those positive messages aren't getting through as effectively.
Exactly. And that's where those classic symptoms of depression start to crop up.
Hmm.
The lack of motivation, feelings of hopelessness or worthlessness, difficulty experiencing pleasure. It's all connected.
And that's why understanding those three factors, genetics, life events, and brain chemistry, suddenly it's not just a bunch of sciencey jargon, right? It's like, oh, this is how it all ties together.
It gives you a roadmap, and thankfully this podcast episode we're dissecting, it doesn't stop there. It goes on to explore treatment options, and I have to say, it takes a pretty comprehensive approach, which I appreciate.
So it talks about therapy and medication, and I like that it doesn't frame it as an either-or situation.
Right. It's not about picking one or the other.
It's more like these are tools in your toolbox, and you can use the ones that work best for you.
Exactly. It might be just therapy, it might be just medication, or, and this is actually super common, it might be a combination of both, used together.
And then on top of that, the excerpt talks about those lifestyle changes we can make, which, let's be honest, sometimes feels a little bit like, oh, here comes the lecture on eating my vegetables.
I know, right? But I think what this excerpt does well is it highlights how powerful those lifestyle changes can actually be.
Right.
It's not about being perfect. It's about making sustainable changes that support your overall well-being.
And when it comes to mental health, those everyday choices we make, they really can make a world of difference.
100%. And the excerpt, it specifically calls out physical activity, healthy eating, and getting enough sleep.
The trifecta. So let's break those down a bit, starting with exercise.
Okay, so we all know exercise is good for us, right?
Supposedly.
But when you're feeling depressed, sometimes the last thing you want to do is drag yourself to the gym or go for a run.
Oh, tell me about it.
But here's the thing. Even small amounts of physical activity can make a huge difference. Because when you move your body, your brain actually releases these chemicals called endorphins, and they have mood-boosting effects. So it's like literally a natural way to lift your mood.
That explains that whole runner's high thing I've heard about.
Exactly. And then there's food.
Hmm.
We are what we eat, right? And that applies to our brains just as much as our bodies. A diet that's rich in fruits, vegetables, lean proteins, healthy fats, all those good things you hear about, it provides your brain with the nutrients it needs to function optimally.
So it's like giving your brain premium fuel instead of running it on junk.
You got it. And of course, we can't forget about sleep,
The holy grail. It always feels so elusive, though, doesn't it?
especially when you're dealing with depression. Because insomnia and depression, they often go hand in hand. But here's why sleep is so crucial. When you sleep, your brain finally gets a chance to rest, recharge, and process all the information it's taken in throughout the day. It's like hitting the reset button.
So when we're sleep deprived, is that why we tend to feel more irritable, more anxious, just
Radically,
okay?
precisely. Sleep deprivation, it messes with your mood, your concentration, your ability to cope with stress, everything.
And what's really interesting is this excerpt, it doesn't just stop at the physical stuff. It also dives into mindfulness and self-compassion, which, okay, those sound a little bit, I don't know, new agey. Like, how do you actually incorporate those into your daily life?
I get it. I get it. It can sound a little vague.
Yeah.
But essentially, mindfulness, it's about learning to pay attention to the present moment without judgment.
Okay, so not dwelling on the past, not stressing about the future, just being here now.
Exactly. It's about noticing those thoughts and feelings as they come up, but not getting swept away by them. Like imagine you're watching clouds drift by in the sky. You see them, you acknowledge them, but you don't try to grab onto them or control them.
And self-compassion, what does that look like? Because it's hard to be kind to yourself, especially when you're, struggling.
It's so true. We're often our own harshest critics. But think about how you'd treat a close friend who was going through a rough time. You'd be supportive, understanding, right? You wouldn't beat them up for struggling. Self-compassion is about extending that same kindness and understanding to yourself.
That's huge. And the last thing this excerpt emphasizes is the importance of seeking help. Which, again, easier said than done. There's still so much stigma around mental health, so it can feel really scary to actually reach out for help.
You are absolutely right. There is so much stigma. But here's the thing. Reaching out for support, whether it's to a therapist, a doctor, a trusted friend, or family member, it's not a sign of weakness. It's a sign of strength. It means you're taking charge of your mental health and saying, I deserve to feel better, and I'm willing to ask for help to get there.
And that's a perfect note to end on, I think. So, to our listener, if you're struggling with depression, please know that you're not alone. There's no shame in asking for help. In fact, it's one of the bravest things you can do.
And there's hope. There really is. With the right support and a willingness to put in the work, recovery is possible. You deserve to live a full and meaningful life, and it starts by prioritizing your mental health.
Beautifully said. And on that note, until next time, stay curious.